what's happening with this European debt crisis we hear so much about? Well, it's being called a growth crisis. Why? Because nations took out lots of debt with the assumption that the economy would continue to grow, and therefore they'd be able to pay back that debt fairly easily. Now that the economy isn't growing, that debt becomes unrepayable. So Greece is negotiating with its creditors a 70% downgrade on it, write down on its debt. Who's next in line? Spain, Italy. It's fundamentally a trade-off. Either we have a sovereign debt crisis in which nations effectively go broke, or they renegotiate with the banks, and then we have a banking crisis because the banks are insolvent because they're holding these toxic assets of Greek bonds or Spanish government bonds or what have you. We've gotten hooked on economic growth to the point that if the economy stops growing, it doesn't just stabilize, it goes into a tailspin. What's the answer to all of this? Well, there's no solution, if by solution we mean getting back on the same old trajectory of economic growth, population growth, and so on. We are, I believe, at a fundamental turning point in history. And by saying that, I don't mean this very moment right now, and as of tomorrow, the world will be bankrupt and riots in the streets and so on. What I'm saying is this decade is a fundamental turning point. We've already seen the beginning of it with the crash of 2008. And I don't think we'll see the end of it in our lifetimes. The rest of our lives are going to be spent under fundamentally different economic conditions from what we've been used to and what we've been taught to believe should be the way things turn out for us. So rather than solutions, I think we have to think about adaptive strategies. How do we adapt to these new economic conditions so as to minimize both human suffering and environmental damage? And that certainly can be done. I say build local resilience because, first of all, our strategies need to emphasize local responses. If transportation fuels are going to become more scarce and expensive, that means that globalization will be running effectively in reverse. All of the financial incentives that made long-distance trade economically efficient are going to start operating in the other direction, making local production for local consumption more economically efficient. Resilience is in some ways the opposite of economic efficiency. If it's economically efficient to grow all of your corn in Iowa, corn grows really, really well in Iowa. It may be cheaper to grow corn in Iowa than anywhere else. Well, in that case, we should grow all of our corn in Iowa, nothing in Iowa except corn. It's economically efficient, but it produces a brittle system, because if the corn crop in Iowa fails, then nobody has corn and Iowa has nothing. So by diversifying and also by creating redundancy within the system, we sacrifice some economic efficiency, but we gain resilience. So what is resilience? It's the ability to bounce back in the face of shocks. Shocks are on the way. Economic shocks, environmental shocks. So what we need is resilience organized at the local level with regard to food systems, transport systems, financial systems, and more. As we do all of this, I think we're going to have to reform economics itself, because as a discipline, economics is a product, an intellectual product, if you will, of this anomalous fossil-fueled period of the last 200 years. It's only been 200 years since the days of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So economists have looked out in the world and they've seen constant economic growth, and they've concluded this is normal, natural, it can go on forever, and that's what we should aim for. They've concluded that the entire environment is just a subset of the economy. It's a pile of resources that we extract, turn into products, and then that becomes waste. when in fact the entire human economy is a subset of the ecosystem, of the global ecosystem, always has been, always will be. And if the ecosystem fails, there is no human economy. We have to understand that growth in population and consumption is fundamentally unsustainable. You can do it for a while, as we have done for the past couple of centuries, but you can't grow either population or consumption forever. And the limits are not just theoretical. They are very real and increasingly immediate. So we should be planning for what size economy do we want, are we willing to live with, and what size economy can the Earth support? We should be thinking that way in terms of not only the global economy, but also what size cities should we be aiming for? Just how big should Vancouver aim to be? Is anybody asking that question? Renewable resources have to be harvested at less than the rate of natural replenishment. It's a simple concept. A 10-year-old can understand it. It's taken a couple of centuries for PhD economists to wrap their heads around it. But we're obviously out of compliance with this simple principle because we're drawing down fossil reservoirs of renewable resources as well as non-renewable resources like the water of the Ogallala Aquifer in the western United States. We're cutting forests faster than they regenerate in many parts of the world, ancient rainforests, harvesting fish, and so on. And then finally, non-renewable resources, where they can be recycled. Of course, we should recycle them. Where they can't be, we just simply have to start using less. It's not only fossil fuels among the non-renewable resources that are becoming more scarce and expensive. Up until about the year 2000, the whole list of minerals and metals from antimony to zinc were actually getting cheaper every year. It sounds counterintuitive. Why would they be getting cheaper if they're non-renewable and we're extracting them all the time? In principle, we were running out. Not in absolute terms, but we were drawing down the finite stocks. Why would they be getting cheap? Because we were applying more and more cheap energy to the process of digging deeper, refining lower grade ores, and globalizing the whole process of resource trade. So copper, antimony, zinc, tantalum, all of them were becoming less expensive. And so economists looked at this and they said, well, there's the magic of the market. We'll never face resource scarcity because of the magic of the market. Well, guess what? Since about the year 2000, as oil has become more expensive, the cost of many, actually most of these mineral and metal raw materials has also risen. So here's a question. I just presented a few sort of commonsensical economic principles or rules. Can we follow those rules and still make one of these? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a really interesting question, one that we should be asking, because we seem to have collectively decided that these are the coolest things ever invented in human history. And if we really love them so much, well, how are they made now? Through virtually slave labor on the other side of the planet, so a lot of transportation is involved, using rapidly depleting non-renewable resources. And then what do we do with them at the end of their useful lifetime? We chuck them into a landfill. That's a non-sustainable practice. And when we use that word unsustainable, I think we should really viscerally understand we're not saying that it's not eco-groovy. We're saying it can't continue. So at what point does this model become impossible to pursue? At what point do we stop making iPhones or what have you? I don't know. I mean, is it 5 years from now? Is it 10 years from now? My crystal ball isn't that clear, but surely it's not that far. It's not that long into the future. Can we make these out of locally available, renewable resources using paying our workers decent salaries? It'd be interesting if somebody tried. As we make this fundamental economic shift, I think it is important that we look on the bright side. I've been giving you some pretty gloomy information, I know, but it's also true that we have paid a lot in human terms for economic growth. We have traded community for a sense of individualism that served the interests of the market, served the interests of economic growth. We've lost the sense of intergenerational solidarity. We've traded cooperation for competition, and so on. There are lots of things that aren't at peak. And if we emphasize those and deliberately try to bring them back into our lives, it's very possible we could have actually happier lives even as we consume much less. So we need to get rid of GDP altogether, which only measures actually the economy that is going away. And we need to start measuring what we want more of, whether we call it gross national happiness or some kind of genuine progress indicator. All of these things have been researched and studied and are being used in various places. One useful model that's being explored is the idea of transition towns, making this transition away from constant growth and the use of fossil fuels, reliance on fossil fuels, to what comes after, but doing it consciously, deliberately, and welcoming the process, saying, well, maybe life could be better without fossil fuels. What does that look like? Well, we'll only find out if we get together as a community and emphasize what is working. I've been promoting the idea of community economic laboratories, places set aside, hopefully at the center of town, in towns and cities around the world, where alternative economic models can be brought together and mainstreamed. Already, almost every community has some kind of alternative economic model going on, whether it's as simple as a credit union or a car share program or something of that sort. But usually these are considered fringe and sort of beside the point in terms of what makes the community go. Well, as the sort of mainstream engine of the economy begins to sputter, as the big banks find themselves weighed down by their toxic assets, we're going to need all these alternative economic models to become the mainstream, and that's more likely to happen if people know of their existence, so that if they want to volunteer their time, they'll know where to go. If they need help, they'll know where to go. I'm going to end by suggesting that this transition that I've been describing is a big deal, as important as the harnessing of fire several million years ago that enabled us to cook our food and alter our environments in various ways, or language, which emerged several tens of thousands of years ago that enabled us to coordinate our behavior across space and time, and had all kinds of ancillary effects, religion, mathematics, literature, on and on and on. The agricultural revolution of 10,000 years ago that enabled us to produce seasonal surpluses of grains so that we could have cities and full-time division of labor and civilization. And then the fossil fuel industrial revolution of 200 years ago. These were distinct, discrete, transitional points in human history that changed everything. I think the next one is going to be on that order. We could call it the sustainability revolution. Maybe it's presumptuous of us at this point to put any kind of label on it, but it will be a moment when we learn to live within Earth's limits, when we grow up as a species, if you will. And that's effectively the challenge that faces us for the remainder of our lifetimes, whether we're 8 years old or 80 years old. These will be the conditions, these will be the challenges in which that we will be facing and surmounting. So thank you for your attention.